Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily.
I will never be able to forgive.
A verdict in the case of a young man accused of killing his parents.
A mother's head found in a pot on a stove, blood on the walls, cuts on the defendant's hands, severed hands upstairs.
Our experts on why the defendant was accused of knowing so much about such gruesome acts.
A classic case of overkill.
And we're just starting to dive into the Breonna Taylor grand jury recordings.
Plus, attorneys for the cops accused of murdering George Floyd say they fear for their safety.
Law and Crime Daily covers court cases from coast to coast.
Welcome, everybody, to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Aaron Keller, along with Brian Buckmeyer and Terry Austin. Let's go straight to the jury's verdict against Joel Guy Jr. in the killings of his mother and father.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Joel Michael Guy, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder of Joel Guy Sr.
Count number 2, please.
Guilty of first-degree premeditated murder of Lisa Guy.
Count number 3.
Guilty of first-degree felony murder of Lisa Guy.
Count number 4.
Guilty of first-degree felony murder of Joel Guy Sr.
Count number 5.
Guilty of felony murder of Lisa Guy.
Count number 6.
Guilty of abuse of a corpse of Joel Guy Sr.
And count number 7.
Guilty of abuse of a corpse of Lisa Guy.
Remember, this is the case where police found the defendant's mother's head cooking in a pot on the kitchen stove. Upstairs, the defendant's father's severed hands in a praying position. The judge immediately issued the maximum sentence for the most serious counts.
After being tried by a jury of peers, the first-degree premeditated murder of Joel Michael Guy, the court now sentenced you to life in prison in the Tennessee Department of Corrections. Count number 2, after being found guilty by a jury of peers of the first-degree premeditated murder of Lisa Guy, I now enter sentence of life in prison in the Tennessee Department of Corrections.
Sentencing on other counts, including abuse of a corpse, will occur in November. So, Terry Austin, you called this verdict when we discussed it during the last broadcast, guilty as charged.
Absolutely. But, I have to admit, it was an easy call. I think the only thing the defense could have done is said that there was insanity. Under Tennessee law, you can claim insanity, but you have to prove under clear and convincing evidence. The defense has that initial burden, and they decided not to do that. So there wasn't anything more they really could have done because of all of the evidence against him.
Brian, the jury took 3 hours to reach this decision, even with strong evidence.
Yeah, it was interesting. I actually would have guessed they would have got to this decision a lot sooner. I saw a lot from the prosecution. I didn't really see much from the defense. I didn't think they had much to really combat that strong case the prosecution put forward.
Yeah, certainly the defense tried to make some arguments. They tried to inject a little bit of reasonable doubt, but the bottom line, the jury saw the prosecution's case and believed it because the evidence was just so strong. The jury saw volumes of gory evidence in this case. In fact, it's sickening to think about it. Among the disturbing images we can show you without being disrespectful is this video of a mountain of evidence the authorities tagged in a bathroom. It includes knives, alcohol, and peroxide, chemicals prosecutors successfully argued were used during the crime. Immediately after the verdict came victim impact statements. Law and Crime Daily's Terry Austin has those for us. Terry.
The murders shocked the Louisville, Kentucky community. Lisa Guy's mother was so heartbroken, she was unable to attend the funeral and died the next day. Friends and family gathered in court to share their feelings on what the case meant to them.
My sister was the type of person who loved deeply. She loved the family, she loved her mother, she loved the father, her sister, and I, her husband. She loved her children and stepchildren. She loved the grandchildren. Her love was taken. It was taken from this world by murder.
I was robbed of having my father walk me down the aisle. And Lisa, my last mother on earth, was taken away. She was the most loving and giving person I've ever met. For them to have to go through this tragedy so young is it's heartbreaking. I still have Dad on speed dial. Like, it hurts me every day not to be able to speak to him. Dad and Lisa were wonderful. They were larger than life. They were so happy. They were such really good people. And
They loved him. They loved him so much. They loved all of us. I don't understand it. He has taken something from myself, from my children, his dad and Lisa's grandchildren. I pray that we can move on from this and that we can put this behind us.
It's such a sad case here. Terry, cases like these rip families apart. You've got a defendant and victims all related to one another. The question legally is, do statements like those that we just heard influence judges?
Well, Aaron, you're right. The statements actually brought me to tears, and they do affect the judge. While they're not supposed to be influenced by these statements, they do feel it. And Judge Swart actually said because the family said to him they were religious, he actually quoted part of the Bible, and he said, where sin did abound, grace did much abound. So he really tried to relate to the families, but he applied the law as he should have.
Brian, in many states, victims have a legal right to speak. How do you prepare a client to face accusers in such a manner as we just saw?
It starts from day one, building that trust and respect with your client and leading all the way up to the end of the trial, where you have to be able to turn to your client and say, you know what, you're going to hear some things you're not going to like, you're not going to respond well to. You've just got to remember all eyes are on you, especially that of the judge, and he's ultimately going to come down with a verdict that you have to be respectful for and try to get the best from, in demonstrating that you're the type of person who can be respectful in his court.
And sometimes defendants choose to speak themselves. In this case, we didn't see the defendant himself testify or speak at that sentencing hearing. Maybe he'll have something to say when the next sentencing hearing happens on the lesser counts that he was convicted of in this proceeding. We'll have to keep an eye on that when it happens. Forensic evidence helped secure this conviction, of course. Authorities found blood evidence on scissors, on gloves, and on walls in the home the victims shared. The evidence survived even though the defendant's notebook contained passages about making sure it was cleaned up. And the defendant himself was caught on video and seen by police in these photos with cuts to his hands. Prosecutors say it's strong evidence he suffered a wound, while they say he stabbed his parents over and over. The defense stipulated the wound occurred during an altercation with the victims, but backtracked during closings and said, "We didn't know when or how the wounds occurred." Those are just some of the images, but when we return, some of the forensics testimony, expert conclusions, and etc. that were used by prosecutors to secure this conviction. And later on, new court papers filed by the defense in the case against one of the 4 officers accused of murdering George Floyd. And it paints a chaotic scene and also begs a judge to take control of the courthouse surroundings for future hearings. That's when we return on Law and Crime Daily. Back now to the trial of Joel Guy Jr., where forensic evidence was key to the prosecution's case. Law and Crime's Brian Buckmeyer takes us through the expert testimony. Brian.
Prosecutors hired a special forensic anthropologist to examine the skeletal remains of the victims. Dr. Murray Marks is best known for his work as a professor at the University of Tennessee's Body Farm. Dr. Marks studied the trauma to the victims' bones and the possible method of dismemberment. Lisa Guy was decapitated, her arms cut from her shoulders, and her legs cut from the knees. Joel Guy Sr.'s arms and legs were disarticulated. Dr. Marks attempted to explain to the jury how these injuries could have occurred.
There was no saw marks, so there was nothing that was associated with chopping or sawing.
Could these sharp force injuries have been inflicted with any type of knife? I mean, do you have an opinion?
Oh, yes, definitely. I'm not sure what other sharp force injuries, those types of injuries I've seen before have always been associated with it. Research that anthropologists have done, graduate students, publications have used implements like that to produce wounds in bone that are synonymous with what I saw.
Can you disarticulate limbs with a knife?
Yeah, I mean, if you have the patience and the perseverance, I mean, it takes time to cut through the ligaments, the muscles, the joint capsules. I mean, it's a lot of work to disarticulate a body at the joint surfaces. Yeah, but it could be done with a knife.
Joel Guy Jr. was reportedly studying to become a plastic surgeon at Louisiana State University. Law and crime expert and professor of forensics Joseph Scott Morgan wonders if the defendant could have been using what he learned in the classroom to commit this crime.
It's as if he's gone to a playbook here, and that's the way I would frame this. This is an indication to me that he has studied. He has looked into this, which goes to purpose, which goes to planning, increasing the temp. And he specifically states in there that it does speed decomposition. As a professor of forensics, I can most assuredly tell you that that is accurate. It's an accurate statement. We actually find that in our text that we use. It would not have taken long for them to have died because of the number of insults the body sustained. However, when it comes to the dismemberment or disarticulation and the rendering down of the body, this is what's so mind-blowing. This man would have spent hours upon hours in the home with his parents' bodies after this, because it takes some time to literally take a body apart and then to apply it to this solution. He had been ruminating over this for some time, so he was prepared. He just didn't know how to utilize the tools at his disposal.
So, Brian, again, the disturbing part of this is the notebook, the planning, and then the gruesomeness of the killing.
I mean, all of this is disturbing because you can look at it from 2 points. You can look at it from the actual execution of his plan or the forethought. I mean, he's thinking about this months, if not more, beforehand. Then he goes to their home for Thanksgiving, sits there with them for a whole day, and then commits the act. There's no part of this that isn't gruesome.
Terry, the jury didn't believe anything that the defense said, apparently. They convicted across the board as charged.
As well they should. I mean, I think the evidence was evidently clear here. He was the one who killed his parents. He was the one who dismembered the body. And what I'm left with is why. In fact, we heard so much evidence about the mother and the father who gave so much to him. Why would he kill them like this? We know it was money, but why would he really dismember their bodies? It was a gruesome crime and there's no reason for it.
We probably will never know the complete truth as to those questions, Terry, but we can certainly wonder because, again, we have another sentencing hearing coming up in that case. And still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, a renewed effort to move the George Floyd murder trials out of the Twin Cities. But first, killer dad Chris Watts admitted he murdered his wife and his children. But he's apparently thinking these days about a new Netflix film which chronicles the crimes he had admitted he committed. We're back in just a moment. An explosive documentary on Netflix now features the case of Chris Watts. It's called American Murder, The Family Next Door, and it's about the father convicted of murdering his wife and their 2 young daughters. A source with regular contact to Watts in prison tells People magazine that the 35-year-old convict is triggered by the documentary. He can't see it, and he'll probably never see it, the source says. It brings back painful, awful memories of 2018 for him. Watts pleaded guilty and is serving a life sentence. The Watts family story was also featured on the Law and Crime Network series Buried with Love.
The questions that have screamed out to anyone who will listen since August 13th of 2018 are why and how. Why did this have to happen? How could a seemingly normal husband and father annihilate his entire family? For what? These are the questions that only one individual in this courtroom or on this planet knows the answers to.
Shannon, Bella, and Nico are loving, caring people. They love life. They love being around people who love them. I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. You buried my daughter Shannon and Nico in a shallow grave, and then you put Bella and Celeste in huge containers of crude oil. You heartless monster. This is hard to say, but may God have mercy on your soul. I hope you enjoy your new life. It's nothing like the one you had out here.
We loved you like a son. We trusted you. Your faithful wife trusted you. Your children adored you, and they also trusted you. Your daughter Bella Marie sang a song proudly. I don't know if you got to see it, but it was Daddy, You're My Hero. Daddy, I love you. I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives.
Terry, this is another emotional case. Why is Watts suddenly triggered now of all times. Not when he was apparently committing the crimes, but now.
Well, you know, it's interesting. He probably, as the monster he is, put the memory behind him and was able to move forward, even though he's in prison. And now that this Netflix series has come out as of September 30th, it's in the forefront. Obviously, he can't see it, but he knows people are seeing it. And it's bringing back these terrible memories of him murdering his family.
Brian, the defendant pleaded guilty, of course, and he's in prison for life. What might his attorney have told him during those discussions when he said, I want to plead guilty?
So as a defense attorney, you have every right and you must explain to them what that means, what penalties you can face and what collateral consequences you can suffer. You have to make sure that they are making the decision knowingly and intelligently. But it's ultimately their decision and you cannot tell them yes or no. You just have to educate them as best as you can.
And Terry, in this case, the defendant just said, hey, look, I have been counseled and I'm making this decision.
Right. He was knowingly making that decision and he knew the evidence against him. So why put the state and the family through a trial when everything is pointing the finger to him?
It's another case that will take us a long time to try to process and make sense of. The documentary series on Netflix, and of course, again, a guilty plea out of Chris Watts, no trial in that one. And when we come back, a renewed motion to move the trials of the 4 officers accused of killing George Floyd of Minneapolis to another location, all because of scenes like these. Stick around for our analysis of arguments by the defense. That's coming up. Grand jury recordings are finally public in the Louisville, Kentucky police shooting death of Breonna Taylor. At the time of this broadcast, we're just getting into the approximately 15 hours of material released as part of what's said to have been a 20-hour proceeding. The recordings include interviews with witnesses, 911 calls, and other factual evidence, but they do not include instructions from prosecutors. The police claimed they did knock and announce their presence. The detective who was indicted for shooting into neighboring apartments, but not for killing Taylor, feared there was a semi-automatic weapon in Taylor's apartment. We'll have a complete analysis on our next broadcast. To the Twin Cities now, where attorneys for one of the 4 former police officers accused in the alleged murder of George Floyd are accusing the trial judge of making a mess out of a recent proceeding. Here's the defense argument. Law&Crime's cameras were there as a large crowd gathered.
When these cops are convicted,
and made a large amount of noise.
and it's gonna be a glorious morning.
As the defendant police officers left court and as officials attempted to speak.
Motions that have been heard by the court.
Now, attorneys for J. Alexander King are flipping the protesters' tactics against them by arguing the trial or trials should be moved to another county. Speaking of a co-defendant, they wrote, Mr. Chauvin, who is in custody, was subjected to a degree of humiliation by being paraded in public dressed in jail clothes and body armor. The misspelling of clothes appears in the original. The document further says attorneys and defendants were harassed upon arrival and departure from the courthouse. Totes Howe and his attorney were followed for several blocks by jeering protesters. Other attorneys and clients were also harassed, the document says. Attorney Earl Gray and defendant Thomas Lane were physically assaulted. Rioters caused $2,000 in damage to a private vehicle. And the so-called chaotic events could be heard inside the courthouse. The defendants further complained that court security officers told them to wait until George Floyd family attorney Ben Crump stopped speaking to the crowd.
We demand justice for George Floyd Jr.
They say that advice was foolish because they say Crump and his fellow lawyers would incite the crowd, making their departure far more risky and tempt rioters to storm the courthouse. In summary, the defense argues that local prejudices and feelings and a riotous crowd prevent a fair trial from being held locally, because a jury would likely hear the protesters, and witnesses entering and leaving the court facility will be intimidated, they argue. Plus, the attorneys and their defendants say they fear for their safety. Okay, Brian, so the defendants want this trial moved for all of the reasons I just quoted from the court documents, but they're also reminding the judge that he has the power to control the courthouse premises in the interest of justice. That's pretty well-established law.
Right, so this is a 2-part issue. One, the question is whether or not to move to a different place and where. And to that, my question is, where would you go? I mean, there are protests of George Floyd all over this country, let alone this world. I mean, Toronto, Nairobi, places in South Korea, everywhere they're protesting this. I don't know where they think they can go. In terms of controlling the actual atmosphere, yes, the judge had that ability, but you can't keep people off of private property. They're going to be able to yell, public property. They're going to be able to yell from the streets as they're doing here.
So, Terry, one of the cases that's being cited by the defense here is the Sam Shepard case. That's one of the key cases on pretrial publicity. It's about the case which became the subject of the TV series and the movie The Fugitive. It's the case that everybody goes to when they want to make these arguments.
Right. And Aaron, I agree with Brian, but I also think that the attorneys for the police officers have an argument here. The Shepard case is about a man who allegedly killed his wife. And the issue there was, balancing the free press with the defendant's right to a fair and speedy trial. Initially, the court said no and rejected the argument, and he actually spent 10 years in prison. But the Supreme Court ultimately said, look, it was tainted. You can have a new trial, and he was acquitted. So it's a decent argument, but, I don't know if it will prevail.
Okay, so Brian, when you boil it down here, is the solution more security, controlling protests, moving the trial, none of the above, all of the above?
I think best case scenario is more security. Again, wherever you move this trial, this is going to happen. People have the ability to move from one county to another. So if anything, you've got to ensure the safety of the defendant getting to and from court and ensure that the proceedings can go as they're intended to without any interruptions.
A collision here of constitutional rights, free speech, fair trials. This is where law gets sticky. Brian and Terry, great analysis here on Law and Crime Daily. As always, great to be with you. And thanks for joining us for our discussions about justice in America. And a reminder, criminal cases are always on the Law and Crime Network.
I'm Dan Abrams, and this is the Law and Crime Network.
The only 24/7 network with expert legal analysis and gavel-to-gavel live trial coverage. Watch the Law and Crime Network today.